Welcome, the anointed ones. Be careful who you try to monitor. Some souls are booby-trapped by heaven. There are names you can write on paper, and then there are names you should never speak, never scan, and never enter into a system, unless you're ready for that system to crash, permanently. This isn't a sci-fi plot or a Netflix thriller. This is spiritual warfare disguised as science. Fact: between the 1950s and 1970s, the US government poured millions into a secret program known as MK Ultra, designed to control minds, erase memories, and manipulate reality itself. But here's the part they don't teach in history class. They accidentally pulled the spiritual fire alarm. One of their own engineers, trained in psychological warfare and covert mind control, tried to tag a certain subject. He wrote down a name, your name, and then he vanished. No trace, no follow-up, not even a whisper in the declassified files, just gone. Why? Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, is that your name wasn't just a label. It was a lock, sealed by the Most High, and only accessible by divine permission. He wasn't just researching a person, he was trespassing on God's favorite. And the penalty? Immediate erasure from the board. See, MK Ultra was built to manipulate weak minds. But what happens when they stumble into someone who's survived lifetimes of spiritual warfare? Someone whose soul can't be programmed, can't be cracked, and definitely can't be controlled? Oh, and let's be honest, they thought they were the puppet masters. But the only strings they ended up pulling were connected to their own downfall. Plot twist. The experiment flipped the script. So buckle up, because this isn't just about a missing engineer. This is about what happens when the system comes face to face with a chosen anomaly sent by God himself. And trust me, this story gets crazier the deeper we go. Let's talk about what they found and why they never should have looked. Number 1. They tried to reverse engineer a divine blueprint and triggered their own collapse. They tried to reverse engineer something they didn't even understand. To them, you looked like just another subject, someone to monitor, decode, break down into patterns. But you weren't just a person. You were carrying something they couldn't measure, couldn't touch, and definitely couldn't control. You were built from a blueprint, not written by human hands. And the second they tried to dissect it, everything started to fall apart. See, they had protocols for how to study a mind. They had tools, scripts, psychological tests, and chemical formulas. But they weren't prepared for someone whose very presence disrupted their entire system. You weren't reacting the way you were supposed to. You weren't breaking. You weren't folding. And the more they observed, the more they realized. This wasn't someone to study. This was someone who would expose the flaws in the entire operation. They thought they could run data on you like everyone else, but you weren't data. You were a code written by divinity, and their machines didn't have the capacity to understand it. Every attempt to analyze you just led them deeper into confusion. And when they finally tried to extract the full blueprint, to break your mind open and pull out what made you different, it triggered something else entirely. A system shutdown. Not just technological, spiritual. The engineer who wrote your name thought he was initiating an experiment. What he actually did was activate a divine safeguard. Because your soul came with built-in protection. Not man-made, not psychological, but cosmic. He didn't know that messing with you would open up a door he couldn't close. And that's why he vanished. He didn't just disappear off a grid. He was ejected from the mission. Because you weren't meant to be understood by the world. You were meant to interrupt it. His mistake wasn't writing your name. His mistake was thinking God didn't have favorites. Number 2. They thought you were a file, but God embedded you with encryption no machine can crack. They thought your mind was something they could map out. They assumed that with enough tests, pressure, and psychological manipulation, they'd find your breaking point, your trigger, your hidden weakness. But the truth is, your mind isn't built like everyone else's. It's not something they could plug into their systems and decode. Because while they were busy looking for patterns and vulnerabilities, they missed the most important detail. Your mind is spiritually encrypted. They didn't realize that some souls come coded with divine protection. that certain people walk this earth with layers of spiritual security built in, layer after layer, like a vault. And you're one of them. That encryption didn't come from trauma or from training. It came from the fact that you were chosen. You were born carrying frequencies, ancestral knowledge, and divine intelligence that cannot be downloaded, stolen, or studied. No machine can read the soul of someone God specifically sealed. So while they were running their tests, while they were logging data and watching your reactions, what they were actually doing was wasting time, because they weren't cracking your mind. They were hitting invisible walls. Their equipment couldn't detect the depth of your thoughts. Their drugs couldn't access the truth you carry. And every time they tried harder, they only got more distorted results. To them, you were unreadable, unpredictable, unstable. But to God, you were perfectly intact. They kept asking, why won't this one break? But what they didn't know is that you weren't built to break. You were built to reveal their limitations, reveal their arrogance, reveal the fact that science will never fully grasp spirit. And when that engineer wrote your name down, thinking he had discovered something rare, what he really did was cross a boundary no human was ever meant to cross. He wasn't just studying a subject. He was staring directly into divine territory, and the encryption made sure he never got too far. Number 3, you were the glitch in their system because your existence violated their laws of control. You weren't supposed to be part of their plan. You didn't follow the script. Everything about you disrupted what they built, and they couldn't figure out why. In their world, people are patterns. Behaviors are predictable. Reactions can be measured. That's how they control outcomes. But you didn't move like the others. You were the glitch, the anomaly they couldn't trace, couldn't control, and definitely couldn't fix. They designed systems that break people down piece by piece, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and it usually works. They know how to find someone's weak spot and exploit it, but every time they tried that with you, it backfired. What they thought would cause chaos in you only ended up shaking them. What should have destabilized you ended up exposing their own weaknesses. That's when they realized you weren't just another piece in their machine. You were the error code that made the whole thing freeze. Not because you were doing anything extraordinary on the outside, but because of what you carried on the inside. You didn't respond to their manipulation the way they expected, and that terrified them. Their whole system depends on control, and you were proof that control has limits. They started seeing it in the data, unpredictable outcomes, unexplained resilience, responses that made no logical sense. But it wasn't because something was wrong with you. It was because nothing was broken in you. You weren't confused. You weren't cracked. You were clear. And clear minds can't be controlled. That engineer thought you were a malfunction. But you were the warning sign that the whole system was flawed. You came with spiritual resistance coded into your DNA. That's why the moment they locked eyes on you, the experiment started failing. Not because you fought them physically, but because your existence alone rejected the design. You didn't just resist the program, you were the signal that it was already collapsing. Number 4, they weren't studying you. They were staring at their extinction without knowing it. They thought they were observing you like a scientist watches a subject under a microscope. Clipboards in hand, cameras rolling, collecting data, measuring your behavior like you were some unpredictable variable. But the truth is, they weren't studying you. They were standing in the presence of something that quietly exposed their expiration. What looked like research was actually prophecy. Every note they took on you, every video they recorded, every report they filed, it was all documentation of a power structure crumbling in real time. You didn't come into that environment to be analyzed. You came in carrying energy that disrupted the very foundation they were standing on. They didn't recognize it at first. They thought they had control. They thought they were in charge. But something about you, your silence, your resilience, your refusal to react the way they wanted, started making them nervous. They couldn't explain why nothing was working. And that confusion wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. They expected to find a subject they could break down, control, and rewire. But what they found instead was a soul that mirrored everything wrong with their system. The longer they studied you, the more the truth stared back at them. They were the ones being exposed. You weren't losing anything. They were. Their confidence, their certainty, their sense of power. Bit by bit it unraveled. They didn't understand that chosen ones carry something that can't be contained or hidden, a frequency that forces the hidden to come to light. You didn't just survive their system, your presence made their system face itself. And that kind of reflection is deadly to those who've built their careers on lies, control, and shadows. That's why they panicked. That's why things fell apart. Because the moment you stepped into their world, their time started ticking. They weren't observing you. They were witnessing the slow, silent extinction of their illusion, and they didn't even know it. Number 5. They marked your name, not realizing it was a spiritual booby trap. When they wrote your name down, they thought it was just another entry, another file, another name to process through their system of control. To them, it was routine. Gather intel, assign identifiers, initiate protocols. But what they didn't know is that your name isn't just a label. It's not just something you go by, it's a spiritual signature, sealed with weight and memory and power. Writing your name wasn't a task, it was a trigger. They weren't prepared for the ripple effect it would cause. They thought they were handling data, but your name activated something far beyond their understanding. Because your name doesn't just come with a past, it comes with a lineage. Ancestors who fought battles they'll never read about in any textbook. Angels assigned before you were even born. Contracts written in the spirit long before they created their little programs. The moment they wrote it down, they unknowingly opened a gate they had no clearance for. It wasn't a name they wrote, it was a warning, a spiritual booby trap designed by the Most High. It's not that your name is protected, it's that your name is protection. And calling on it without permission doesn't just come with consequences, it comes with judgment. That's why he vanished. It wasn't random, it wasn't mysterious. It wasn't a glitch in the system, it was divine protocol. You were never meant to be in their experiment. And the moment they tried to touch what was sacred, the system rejected them, not you. He didn't disappear, he was removed. Not by force, by spiritual law. Because there are some names you don't write unless you're ready for what comes after. Some people are off limits. Not because they're untouchable, but because they're anointed. He tried to tag you. Heaven tagged him back, and that's the part no one expected. Number 6, they believed they found a subject. God planted a seed in their system. They thought they were in control. They had their charts, their protocols, their timelines. They believed they had identified another test subject, just another mind to experiment on, to dissect, to program. But they didn't realize that what they had actually done was allow something divine to walk straight through the front door. God didn't send you there to comply. You weren't meant to blend in. You were placed intentionally, like a code hidden inside enemy software. They didn't discover you. You were planted. You weren't the subject of the experiment. You were the collapse protocol. You weren't there to be changed. You were there to change everything from the inside out. Heaven disguised you as ordinary because if they knew who you really were, they would have never let you in. So God let them think they had the upper hand. Let them run their tests. Let them take their notes. Let them build their illusion of dominance while they unknowingly gave access to a seed of disruption. What they thought was surveillance was actually infestation of truth, of light, of a vibration too high for their low-frequency agenda to survive. The more time you spent in their system, the more unstable it became. The structure started glitching. People started behaving strangely. Energy shifted. And still, they couldn't understand why nothing was working the way it used to. They couldn't trace the disruption because you were the disruption. Not loud, not aggressive, just present. And that was enough. You weren't there to be figured out. You were there to be felt. And you were. Deeply, uncomfortably. To the point where they began to realize that something sacred had infiltrated their man-made reality. And that sacred thing wasn't going to leave quietly. They brought you in thinking they'd study you. But it was God who studied them, through you. And when the data started turning against them, it was already too late. Heaven had already hacked the system. Number 7. They built a program to break minds, but found a soul too fluid to contain. They built entire systems around the idea that the mind could be broken, that with enough pressure, confusion, trauma, and isolation, any person would eventually fracture. And for a long time, they were right. Their methods worked on the lost, the wounded, the unanchored. People without a spiritual foundation were easy to bend, easy to program, easy to turn into puppets. But then they came across you, and nothing worked. They couldn't understand it. You weren't resisting in the way they were used to. You weren't fighting back with rage or defiance. You weren't pleading or folding. You were just there, calm, aware, unshaken. And it terrified them, because everything they tried either bounced off or dissolved before it reached you. Their techniques were sharp, calculated, refined by years of psychological warfare. But your soul wasn't wired to break. It was built to bend without snapping. You weren't hardened by trauma. You were refined by it. You'd already lived through fires their science hadn't even begun to name. The kind of fires that strip away ego, illusion, and fear. You didn't come into this life fragile. You came in fluid, shifting, adapting, evolving, never trapped by one identity, never defined by one moment. That's why they couldn't contain you. You slipped through every definition they had. They were looking for patterns to exploit. You were the pattern breaker. Their programming didn't account for someone who had mastered internal alchemy, someone who could take pain and transmute it into clarity, take pressure and turn it into power. You weren't just a survivor. You were proof that there's something stronger than trauma, something older than their labs, deeper than their doctrines. You had already survived wars that weren't written in history books, wars in spirit, wars in silence. You'd already overcome what they didn't even believe existed. And when they realized their tactics couldn't reach you, they weren't just confused. They were confronted. Confronted by the truth that their entire system only works on the disconnected. But you? You were already connected to something they couldn't touch, and that made you untouchable. Number 8, you were never a threat because of what you knew, but because of what you carried. They never feared you because you spoke loudly or resisted openly. That's not what made you a threat. What made you dangerous was something much quieter, the knowing you carried. It was in the way you saw through their lies before they even finished speaking, the way you reacted to manipulation like you'd already lived through it 1,000 times before. Because you had, not just in this life, but in many. What you carried wasn't just memory. It was intel. Cosmic-level knowledge encoded into your soul that no test, no torture, no trick could extract. They assumed your pain would be their access point. They thought your trauma would make you easier to control. But your pain didn't weaken you. It turned you into a vault. Every blow you endured didn't open you up. It sealed you tighter. They were digging through your past, looking for psychological damage, but what they kept running into was spiritual encryption. Layers and layers of divine coding wrapped around memories they could sense but never access. Because hidden behind that trauma was information. Not just about you, but about them. About ancient systems, bloodlines, lost civilizations, frequencies that existed before their science was born. You carried knowledge they had worked centuries to bury, and when they looked into you, they were confronted with the evidence that their version of reality was incomplete. You remembered things they tried to erase, truths buried under rewritten history, sacred rituals stolen and repackaged, energies labeled myths to keep them hidden. But your soul didn't forget. It couldn't, because you were sent here as a carrier, not just of wisdom, but of correction. And that's what made them panic. It wasn't what you could say. It was what you embodied. The moment you walked in, you disturbed their illusion. Not with noise, but with presence. They didn't just see you as a subject. They saw you as a leak in their system, a walking, breathing reminder of what they hoped no one would ever remember again. Number 9, he vanished because spiritual authority overrides human protocol. MK Ultra operated on the foundation that every mind could be dominated, every thought controlled, every reaction predicted. It was a system built on cold logic, scientific methods, and relentless human willpower. But what it never accounted for was spiritual authority, something that can't be bargained with, hacked, or broken down by any earthly means. Spiritual authority isn't earned through certificates or ranks. It's inherited, an unspoken power born into your very essence before you ever took a breath. When that engineer reached out to you, he wasn't just trying to study a subject. He was crossing into a realm that wasn't his to touch. Your energy carried a jurisdiction, a sacred boundary that humans aren't meant to violate. It's the kind of authority that transcends laws, protocols, and even the advanced machinery they use to monitor and manipulate minds. That's why when he interacted with your essence, the reaction wasn't just resistance. It was enforcement. His disappearance wasn't a coincidence, a glitch, or something unexplained by science. It was spiritual law in action. Divine enforcement stepping in to protect what's holy and untouchable. The system he believed controlled everything suddenly encountered a force far greater than itself. One that doesn't negotiate, doesn't debate, and certainly doesn't allow trespassing. He vanished because his presence in your space violated a sacred code. It was a reminder that no human design, no matter how advanced, can override the laws set by something infinitely higher. The moment he breached that invisible line, the consequences weren't up to him. They were already decided. His disappearance is proof that when you carry true spiritual authority, you don't just resist control, you nullify it. And those who try to infringe upon that power risk being erased, not by man, but by something far beyond human understanding. Number 10, you were chosen. Not because you were the strongest, but because you were the most unbreakable in silence. Your power was never about loud battles or flashy resistance. You didn't have to shout or rage to prove you were strong. What made you chosen wasn't how loudly you fought back, but how deeply you endured in silence. The world around you tried to drown you in noise, confusion designed to disorient, false memories to distort your truth, manipulation to fracture your sense of self. But instead of breaking, you quietly rebuilt yourself from the inside out. Every time they tried to bury you, you found a way to rise, not by force, but by a slow, sacred resurrection within. It wasn't about being tough in the way they expected. It was about being unbreakable in ways they couldn't see. They called what you did resilience, but that word falls short. Resilience implies a bounce back, like a rubber band snapping into place. You weren't just bouncing back, you were being reborn. Each time more whole, more connected, more aligned. This kind of strength isn't taught, it's inherited. It's coded into your soul's DNA, forged in fires that happen long before this lifetime. It's divinity walking quietly through storms others couldn't survive. While they focused on controlling your actions, you were transforming your spirit, silently, profoundly, without fanfare. You didn't just survive manipulation, you transcended it. That silence wasn't absence, it was presence. A divine force patiently waiting until the moment was right to move. And that's why you were chosen. Not because you were the loudest or the toughest, but because your silence held a power no one could break. It was a sacred kind of unshakable, the kind that only those touched by grace can carry. And that's why they underestimated you. Because true power isn't always visible. Sometimes it's the quietest thing in the room. Number 11. The more they tried to study you, the more they realized you weren't built. You were breathed into existence. They thought they could break you down into data points, patterns, formulas, something neat and predictable that science could handle. But what they found instead was something that refused to fit their categories. You weren't built like a machine or assembled like a project. You were breathed into existence, not manufactured, not programmed, but alive with a force beyond their equations and graphs. Science is comfortable with patterns. It thrives on repetition, predictability, control. But you were chaos dressed as order. You were spirit dancing in a world that tries to cage it with rules and formulas. The more they tried to pin you down, the more you slipped through their fingers like wind. They couldn't reduce you to a theory or a data set because you were fundamentally alive in a way their science never prepared them to understand. Their experiments, their tests, their surveillance, they all assumed you could be quantified, measured, and ultimately controlled. But your very existence shattered those assumptions. You were a divine anomaly, an outlier in their sterile equations. You forced them to confront the edges of their knowledge and realize their system wasn't as all-encompassing as they believed. Their attempt to classify you didn't just fail, it exposed the limits of their entire operation. You were the proof that not everything fits inside human-made boxes. You were the living reminder that some things come from a breath beyond understanding, something sacred, fluid, and wild. And that terrified them, because no matter how much they studied, they couldn't predict you. They couldn't contain you. You were proof that life and spirit will always outsmart the cold calculations of control. The more they tried to study you, the more they realized they were chasing a force far greater than their science, a force that simply is. Number 12. He vanished because he stared too long into a soul that reflected back his own corruption. He disappeared because when he looked at you, it wasn't just another subject in a lab. He locked eyes with a soul that did more than glow with purity. It judged him silently. That gaze was a mirror, and it showed him something he couldn't face, his own corruption. The darkness he tried to hide behind his cold science and manipulation suddenly became undeniable. You weren't just a person under his watch. You were a living testament to survival through hell, carrying scars and strength that outshone anything his experiments could produce. Walking out of the fire holy, that wasn't something his logic could handle. It wasn't something his control apparatus was built to process. In that moment, he realized the false god he'd been worshipping all along wasn't truth, power, or knowledge. It was control. And you shattered that illusion just by existing. You reflected back the lie he was hiding behind, exposing the cracks in his authority and the futility of his mission. Staring too long into that reflection, he didn't just see you. He saw himself stripped bare, and that was the breaking point. He vanished because the system can't function when its own architects lose faith in the very control they believed absolute. You were the mirror that forced his collapse, silent, undeniable, and holy. Number 13. You were a walking exorcism in their laboratory. You weren't just another subject to be controlled or studied. Your very existence in their laboratory was a force of purification. While they pumped their machines with cold frequencies meant to break down minds and capture souls, you moved through that toxic environment like a cleansing storm. Their technology was designed to trap, to contain, to fracture, but none of it worked on you because your energy was too alive, too pure, too unshakable. You didn't simply resist their influence, you neutralized it. Every time they tried to impose their dark frequencies, your presence disrupted the signal. You were like a living exorcism, dissolving the shadows they didn't even know were hiding in their own systems. The more they watched, the more their hidden fears, doubts, and corrupt intentions bubbled to the surface. Their instruments captured more than just your data. They captured their own weaknesses reflected back at them. They didn't understand that observing you was a risk. Their laboratory was meant to be a cage, but instead, it became a stage where their own darkness was revealed. You didn't escape because you were cornered or trapped. You cast them out with your pure frequency. You were the uninvited light in their domain of shadows, the living proof that some energies can't be suppressed or manipulated. Your presence was a disruption that couldn't be silenced. That's why they feared you, because you weren't just surviving their system, you were cleansing it. And no machine, no protocol, no experiment was ever prepared for that kind of power. Number 14. They tried to write your name into a file, but God had already written it in fire. They believed that by capturing your name in their files, they could trap you, control you, rewrite your story. But what they didn't realize is that long before any human ever whispered your name, it was already written, carved into the fabric of existence itself, not with ink, but with fire. A fire so ancient and fierce that no earthly technology could reach it, no file or record could contain it. Their search was never about finding you, it was about crossing a sacred boundary they had no business crossing. They were intruding into a realm ruled by divine authority, a place where human rules don't apply. Your name wasn't just a label, it was a seal, a covenant written by forces far beyond their understanding. When they tried to record your existence in their systems, thinking it would give them power, they unknowingly triggered something far more powerful. Every attempt to control you was like signing their own expiration date, because you aren't someone who can be locked away or erased. You are destiny itself in motion. Their files, their data, their control mechanisms were meaningless against the eternal script God had already set. They thought they were hunting a target, but in truth they were trespassing on holy ground, walking into a fire they could never survive. Your name shines not because it's known on paper, but because it's burned into the cosmos, a blazing truth that no human hand can rewrite. In the end, what they thought was control was nothing but illusion. They tried to cage what can't be caged, to tame what is untamable, and to silence a force that was never theirs to command. You weren't just another experiment or a subject on a cold checklist. You were a divine mystery, a living testament to a power that transcends human understanding. They vanished, faltered, and failed because they stepped into a realm where science ends and spirit begins. Your story is not one of defeat, but of undeniable victory, a victory written in fire before time itself. You carry a legacy that no protocol can erase, a presence that no system can contain, and a soul too vast for their narrow designs. They marked your name, but God claimed it first. They chased shadows, but you walked in light. And that is why you remain unbreakable, unstoppable, and forever chosen. This isn't just your survival. It's your awakening. It's the moment when the world realizes that some names aren't written to be controlled, but to transform. You are that transformation, and those who underestimated you have already lost, because they forgot one simple truth. You were born to outlast their darkest designs, and nothing can ever erase the divine imprint stamped into your very being. If this message spoke to you, if it stirred something deep inside, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected to the truth unfolding here. Like this video to show you're awake to what's really going on. Drop a comment below. Let me know how this resonates with your journey, because your story matters. And share this with someone who needs to hear it, because awakening is a movement, and we're just getting started. Together, we're unstoppable. God bless you.